My father introduced me, and now it's my son's turn. Woodworking is a passion we'll share forever. Woodcraft understands that. Their people know the right tool for the job, and they make sure we understand how to use it. Their help, it means a lot. Woodcraft knows how we feel because they feel the same way. You know, I enjoy sharing my secrets, and now Jake's teaching me some things too. Woodcraft, helping you make wood work.
Tight Bond Wood Glues, the pro's advantage.
Hello and welcome to Season 3 of I Can Do That. I'm your host, Chad Stanton. Now, if you've never caught an episode of our show before, let me explain it to you. We're teaching you woodworking with some basic tools that you probably have in your basement or garage. Now, can you build these projects if you have a table saw, a drill press, and a bandsaw? Sure, absolutely. But you don't have to. We're going to teach you good, solid woodworking techniques with good joints, and the material is all something that you can pick up out of the big box store. Now, today's project that we're going to be making is this router table. Now, the router is nothing new. We've used this on several projects. But by being able to mount the router into the table, it's going to open up new doors for us. We're going to be able to do some joints with it that we haven't been able to do before. And those joints are going to be able to give us new projects. So, let me clear this bench off and I'll explain more about this router table. So let's take a look at some features of our router table. Now, the majority of this is going to be made out of some 3/4 inch plywood. And the construction is fairly simple. We're just going to be using some glue and butt joints and screws. Now, it also has this fence on it, which is going to allow us to make nice straight cuts with it. And the fence, well, it has a port on the back that you can put your vacuum into. Now, the router sits into the tabletop, making it flush. And we have this clear plexiglass on it too, so we can easily see through to the router. We also have some cubby holes on it that we can store some stuff in, such as your bits, safety glasses, some tools. And there's one thing to point out. Even though these plans are included at the end of this video, this table is made specifically for this router. So if you have a router at home, you might have to tailor fit it because the height could be different, the hole pattern will probably be different, but those are just some minor changes that you can easily do. All right. The first step I need to do is I need to rip down and cut some of this plywood. So let me clear this off and get set up with that, and I'll show you what I'm doing. So as we mentioned before, the majority of this project is made out of our 3/4 inch plywood. And there's two sizes that I'm going to use for the majority of it. One is 16 inches, which will be the top and these bottom bases. The other is 12 inches, which will be the sides and the dividers. So I have some plywood here on the bench, and this project can easily be built out of one 4x8 sheet. I have a smaller piece here just for demonstration. Now, I'm going to want to make my 16-inch piece go in here. So I've measured that out and drew a straight line for it. Now, it's important for me to remember what side of that line that I want to cut on. So I've placed an X just to remind me where to keep that saw blade. Speaking of the saw, I don't want to cut into my bench top, so I have these scrap pieces underneath it. And the saw blade is set so it's just going through my work material. All right, when I want to cut this, I'm going to use a straight edge that I'm going to clamp on here. But keep in mind that the blade here has an offset. So I want to measure that. And I have 1.5 inches. So from my line, I've measured over 1.5 inches at both ends. Now I can clamp my straight edge on it. Okay, and of course, before I use any power equipment, I want to make sure I wear my safety glasses and hearing protection. Okay, I have the 16-inch one done, and I'm going to set this back up with another piece of plywood and cut for the 12 inches. Okay, so I'm ready to cut to length my individual pieces to make up this router table. So the top and these bases, I'm not too worried about the length. And I've measured it out here on the plywood, and I'm just going to cut it with the saw. However, these dividers and the sides, well, I want those to be more precise. So I have this jig here that we used on a previous episode. And this jig is going to allow me to make precise, repeatable, accurate pieces. Now the dividers, well, they measured at 4 inches. So I've made a pencil line here on the jig at 4 inches. And I can take my 12-inch piece of plywood and slide it in. Now on your plywood, you want to pay attention to the ends. This has the factory edge on it, and it may not be straight and could be beaten up and dinged. Now this edge is one that I made a previous cut on, so I know it's going to be straight. So I'm going to slide the piece in to the jig and have it stop at my pencil mark. Now I have the jig clamped down so it doesn't move, and I've adjusted the saw for the depth again. And I'm going to make my cuts. Okay, I can repeat this for as many times as I need to get all the dividers. Now, the sides, I can do the same process. However, when I made this jig originally, it's a little bit short. So what I've done is I put a stop block here at the length that I need for the sides, and it's going to do the same thing. So let me finish making all the cuts that I need, and then we'll do some assembly. All right, so here we already have one of the cubby units already assembled from our pieces. And the assembly is pretty simple, but let me show you the process because it's important that I get these equally divided. So with one of the sides here, I'm going to take a divider, set it up on end, and I know that the space that I have here is 3.5 inches from our plans. So I measure and made a mark with the pencil. Then I set my combination square to that, and I can mark both sides, giving me a clear view of where that middle divider has to go. So I already have the nails in this one placed, and I'm going to use the dividers as supports themselves. Put a little glue on here. put this in place. And so you get the idea. From here, I can put glue on these dividers, continue the same process, flip it over, and do the same. And as far as the back, well, it's just another piece that gets glued and nailed on. All right, let me finish putting this one together, and we'll go on to the next step. So for this one here, I've already attached the base. And the purpose of the base being larger is so you could actually clamp it to the workbench if you want. Now let me show you how I attached it. The placement of this on here doesn't have to be that precise. I just got a rough measurement equal on both sides. And then I traced around the whole unit. From there, I drilled a couple of clearance holes. Now, a clearance hole is slightly larger than the diameter of the screw. And then from the bottom, I'm putting in a few countersinks. At this point, it's just a matter of lining my pencil marks up again. If I can find them. And putting in a few screws. After this, we'll mount the top. So mounting the top, I did the same procedure. I drilled those clearance holes, put the chamfer on it, measured, and I just screwed that on there. I have a couple more screws to put in on the top. Okay, next, I got to make that hole for the router. So let's take a look at this one. There's a procedure you want to do when you're putting this hole and we have to route the inset for the plate. The first thing is you want to make this hole with the jigsaw first. If you do it second, well, the jigsaw could be hitting against the edge of this. The second thing you want to do is you want to route the inset before you cut out the plate. The reason for this is, you'll notice on this one here, I actually routed it a little too big, and I had already cut the plate first. My router then isn't going to sit in there tight, and we need it to be tight so it doesn't move on us. So I had to go back and put these little shims in. If I do that procedure in reverse, I'm going to have a whole lot easier time. Okay. Let me get some measurements on here, and I'll show you how I'm going to cut it out. Okay, so I've already measured and found the center of this, and I used the compass to make a 6-inch circle. Now, I'm going to cut this out, but why did I go with 6 inches? Well, remember, I'm building this router table around this particular router. And this router has this long tail that comes off for the cord. So I kind of took a measurement, got 6 inches, and that's going to make it easier for me to put this in and out. I'm going to start by drilling a clearance hole. And now I'm going to use the jigsaw to cut this out. Okay, you might be tempted to want to take your rasp at this point and clean this up, but I'm going to hold off for a minute because I still have to route down for the plate. So let me get the router set up for that, and I'll show you how I do that next. Okay, I've put the original base back on the router that came with it from the manufacturer. And here is the 8-inch base that we want to set into the tabletop. Now you'll notice that these pencil marks are much bigger than the plate itself. And the reason for that is I have to accommodate for the size of the bit and the edge of this original base. And so I made a jig that will go on and do that. Now I'm going to get this to the size that I need. I also had to adjust the depth of the bit for the thickness of the plexiglass. And I actually want to go a little bit deeper with it. It's better to go a little deeper than not deep enough, and I'll show you why at the next step. But for now, let me clamp my jig on, and I'll do a little routing. Okay, now there's a couple of rules to remember when I'm using the router. To begin with, I'm going to want to make sure that I move the router in a clockwise direction because that is going with the direction that the bit is turning. Also, too, I don't want to take off more than about half the overall thickness of the bit. Lastly, I want to make sure that I work from the center to the outside edge. Don't start from the edge and try and work in because then you won't have any support for the bottom of the router to sit on. All right, besides wearing my hearing protection and safety glasses, this router is going to throw up a lot of sawdust, so I also want to make sure I wear a mask at this point. Okay, now that this is done, I have these round corners to deal with, and I'm just simply going to take a chisel and square them up. All right, a couple more, and then I'll show you how I'm going to cut out the plexiglass. Okay, so I got the corners all squared up, and it's now time for me to make the plexiglass plate for this. Now, let me show you something. Even though I used that jig, the plate out of that one over there, you'll notice that it's a little loose. That's why I made this inset first, and now I'm going to measure and cut the plexiglass. Now this is just some 1/4-inch plexiglass. It's easily purchased at one of the big box stores, And I'm leaving the protective cover that's on it because it's going to reduce the amount of scratches when I cut it. So I'm going to set it in here where I have one corner tight into the routed section, and then with a marker I'm going to cut it actually a little bit heavy. This way I can plane, sand, shave it down, and get a nice tight fit for it. Also too, when I cut this, I'm going to change the jigsaw blade with it. I'm going to go from the coarse blade that I had to cut out the circle to one with more fine teeth. Also, on the jigsaw itself, well, I'm going to change the adjustment to take out all the orbiting. This way it's just a straight up and down cut. Now, if you have a bandsaw, that would be great. You'll cut it out a lot faster, a lot easier, but this will do the trick. Lastly then, after I cut it out, I'm going to have to drill some holes in it, and I'll show you that step next. So I've took some time to fit the plate where it's nice and snug. And I was able to sneak up on that by using either a block plane, a rasp, or a Shinto rasp. I really like the Shinto rasp because it has a different set of teeth on both sides. One side is coarse and the other side is fine. It's basically like a bunch of bandsaw blades joined together. I've also had to drill some holes into the plate. I took the original base plate off of the router, and I used a drill bit that's the same size as the hole, and I first just marked it. Then I could drill all the way through. But I wasn't done there. I have to make sure that the screws sit below the plate. So I had to make a countersunk hole on it, and I did that with another drill bit. And I had to go real slow and take my time so as I didn't drill all the way through. Now, if you had a drill press, that would be great because you could make the setting and you're done. But in this case, I had to go extra slow with it. Now, remember I told you when you route this, I wanted to go a little bit deeper than what the plate was? Well, there was a reason for that. If I didn't go deep enough, the plate would sit up high, and as my workpiece would come across, well, it would hit. But if it's too low, the workpiece could also hit on the way out. So to get that exactly right, what I wound up doing was I put some screws in here. And now I can fine-tune that setting so it's perfectly flush. And that's what I have to do back over here on this one. So once I drill these holes, put my screws in, I'm going to show you then how we're going to make the fence for this router table. So here's the fence to our router table, and there's nothing really complicated about it. It's some pieces of plywood that are just glued and nailed together. Now, the two pieces for it are made out of some plywood that I ripped down to the size of a 1x4. Now, you're probably wondering why I used the plywood and didn't just use a 1x4. Well, the solid wood has the tendency to want to cup, bow, and warp with seasonal changes. The plywood is a lot more stable because it's made up of multiple layers going different directions. So this is more ideal. Now on the fence, I have to drill a hole which is going to allow for the router bit to come up through it. And on the bottom, I want to notch this out so that the vacuum can do its work. So I've already took the time to lay that out on these pieces. So I'll drill this, cut this out on the jigsaw, and then I'll come back and show you how to do these back little pieces for the vacuum port. So I put some glue and nails in this, but I want to make sure that the nails sit below the surface so it doesn't hang up when I push the workpiece through. Now, for these triangle pieces to put on for the vacuum port, well, there's nothing really special about it. I have a scrap piece of plywood, and the first thing I want to do is I want to make sure that I have a true 90 degrees on that. Then I'll place the plywood up to the fence, and I'll make a mark at the bottom and one at the top. Now you'll notice that this fence is out just a little bit. It's not 90 degrees, but I'm not too worried about that because after I cut out this triangle, I can glue and clamp that on there, and that will help bring it in to my true 90 degrees for the fence. Okay, then the last thing I want to put on is this piece for the actual vacuum port. Now, you're going to want to measure the diameter of your hose, and then with the compass, I put it onto the workpiece, and I'm going to use a jigsaw to cut this out. But I made this slightly smaller because after I cut it out, I'm going to use a rasp and sneak up on it so that the hose has a nice snug fit. After that, it's just a matter of cutting it, gluing, and nailing it on. So let me do that, and we'll move on to the next step. Okay, that's a good fit. And the fence, well, it attaches with just a couple of simple clamps. This allows me to adjust it wherever I need it. Now you probably noticed that we don't have a miter slot on this. Well, that's because I don't have a miter gauge for it. So I took a couple of simple scrap pieces of wood and I made this little sled. The sled will ride against the edge of the router table, and I'll be able to attach a sacrificial scrap piece of wood on here for when it goes through into the router bit. Now, if you'd like, you can make a pegboard for your various router bits that you can store into your router table. Or if you'd like, you could dress it up even more with making a couple of drawers. In fact, that's going to be the first project we're going to make with our router table. I'm going to show you a couple of different ways on how to do some drawer construction. So I hope you enjoyed this project and make one for yourself because we're going to use this several times in this coming season. So we'll see you next time here on I Can Do That.